I'm Heather Ferguson, and you have found a Sonar Moment. The Sonar Moment, a monthly interview with CEOs from the Pacific Northwest. We're here at the beautiful Alex Goulden Hall in Victoria, Canada, and today I'll be interviewing Scott Phillips, President, Starfish Medical. Scott, thanks for coming.
It's nice to be here.
I'm glad you could make it. But let's first of all just tell people what it is that Starfish does.
Sure, okay. So Starfish is in the business of medical device development and contract manufacturing, basically. So broadly, our vision is to allow entrepreneurial companies to improve medical care. And so what does that drive us to do? It drives us to think much more broadly than engineering. Because if we want entrepreneurs to be successful, by which we mean that their shareholders get a return on their investment. That's what I mean by successful. Which means that we have to design a device that not only is clinically relevant and interesting or useful, but it can get reimbursed, that they're not going to get attacked by their competitors for their patent infringement, that the margins that they make are sufficient to run a company with, which is a different...
That they've run through all the regulatory hurdles and even manufacturing hurdles at the end of that process.
That's right. So it's a broad front. How do you attack a problem on a broad enough front that gives our client the highest chance of being successful as a company?
You were telling me about, and I just want to give an example of this because it's really quite interesting and quite unique what you do.
Right.
And about the little gadget for ophthalmology. Do you remember that?
So this is a pachymeter, is that right?
Yes, I believe so. And it was quite early on in the development of Starfish that this came out.
That's right. So this is an interesting story. So we were approached by a company in Iowa. I believe this is the story you're talking about. And they had a vision for a device for screening for glaucoma. It would be using ultrasound. It would incorporate a PDA, if you remember what those were.
Oh, what is a PDA again?
Personal digital assistant. Prior to, it was pre-cell phones, pre-smartphones. But,
you know, prior to 2005, I probably would have known that, how things change.
And so it was an interesting story because they had the vision for the product based on their extensive experience in sales and marketing and ophthalmic instrumentation. And there was a new paper, or big review paper that had just been published. And so we worked with them to define what this device would be. We implemented the device, actually created a partnership, and then sold a quarter of the company to a German company that was going to get distribution. And over the course of a year, we implemented the whole device and sold it, and actually did well.
But what I'm seeing, you know, the trend that I see, and you know, it's funny, I've actually heard this from other entrepreneurs as well, is just this huge sense of initiative of oh yeah, we can see how that can be done, you know, or that works. Tell me how you got to Starfish.
Okay, so I think you're right. There's this element of can-do attitude. It's just a basic requirement. And you also have to have a high degree of comfort with uncertainty, right, as an entrepreneur, because you're just charging into things. To some extent, we're aware of the risks, but we're willing to ignore them for the moment, trusting that somehow we'll figure out how to get around them as we get into it.
Sort of like walking across Tibet.
Yeah, that's right. If we were the sort of people that planned everything all out and then executed carefully, we would never start, because it would be obvious that the risks were too high and we didn't have the answers.
So you need a high degree of self-delusion, right?
The high degree of self-delusion is helpful, absolutely. Which actually is an interesting conflict and a transition as you grow and develop a company, because you need to become an operator. You need to recognize how to hire the right people, how to consistently measure things, and how to reliably execute. And those are things that you're not really wired for as you start. And
they're more process-oriented,
yeah,
aren't
that's
they?
right. And so I've had that conflict as well. That's really interesting.
How did you develop through that?
How
did you
that's an interesting. I'm kind of, you know, a lot of entrepreneurs are really visionary and really hard driving and can't stand a detail, like often dyslexic even. Like Richard Branson, very dyslexic, right? And I'm not comparing myself to him, but and I'm kind of in the middle. I like designing systems. I'm an engineer, really. And I like thinking of what might happen next. But I'm not as visionary as the visionaries. I'm not as detail-oriented as the executors. I'm kind of in the middle.
In the middle.
And it's actually a great kind of wiring to be in the type of business that I'm in now.
It's interesting because designing a company is really a lot like designing a medical device,
Yes.
or there's always systems and processes. There are things that you can't ignore, that you have to move through, and there are processes that you have to design to get to the end, right?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think a company is a machine.
Yeah.
And it's very helpful to think of it that way.
A social machine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about the systems of daily huddles, weekly tactical meetings, monthly key performance indicator reviews,
Yeah.
quarterly objective reviews, annual planning, strategic planning. If you set these things in, then you gather the feedback, you set
Yeah.
objectives, you have mechanisms to follow up on them.
Yeah.
Within each department, you have systems as well. You have interviewing systems, you have reviews. You have 360 reviews, which creates a peer culture and grassroots energy into the company.
That's a lot of reviews.
It is a lot of reviews.
It does speak to the idea that what can be measured can be managed.
Yes.
And that's really what you're on.
Yeah, that's the trick, right? How do you build the right level of oversight and feedback mechanisms without choking the organization in process,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's the
And there's a real tension there, isn't there?
Yeah,
It's a fine line. You've got to have that feedback, but you can't measure too much. And
Exactly.
I know I've met people who just measure and measure and measure and measure, and at some point you got to call it quits and move on. Don't
That's
you?
right. In our case, for our management, we on Monday mornings we meet for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
That's our weekly ritual.
Yeah.
Then monthly it takes maybe 2.5 hours,
Yeah.
and we're looking at financials, and we're looking at all the things, maybe 20 things that we measure, and seeing how they're trending and what are we going to do about it, and so on.
And you're always measuring in the context of a vision, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so that's about operations management and
Right.
executions, what I was talking about, and really without that spark of leadership and vision, then it doesn't go anywhere, right? It's just chugging along.
You really do have a family that values experience over money, and yet you've done very well for yourself with Starfish. I mean, you've really got the best of both worlds in so many ways.
Well, that's true. I think I know a lot of entrepreneurs. I'm involved with some entrepreneurial organizations, and it's become clear to me that entrepreneurs are primarily driven by autonomy. Mm-hmm. Really not so much by money. And money is you need money to carry on and to keep developing, and our goals often have some financial aspect to them, but it's rare for me to meet an entrepreneur who's really fundamentally driven by money.
And you actually, your own life was very much about autonomy and about seeking the next experience, even from an early age.
That's very true. Well, in a variety of ways. When I was a child, we went to live in Africa for a year, but I was, as a kid, very independent, very stubborn. I didn't go along with the trends. I paid a social price at school for not adapting to the sort of the proper dress codes and so on. It made me into a bit of an outsider, but probably for the better in the long run, but at the time it
Pretty
was
painful at the time,
painful.
isn't it? Oh no, why can't I fit in?
Right.
That seems to be the common cry among entrepreneurs,
right.
from when they were young.
Yeah, I wonder about that, whether in fact most of us were the outsiders at school, and that's kind of why we're taking on the role that we took on later in life.
But you had already started and sold at least one company.
Well, I as a child, I started a picture framing company in my parents' basement, and I ran that all the way to the end of university, actually. And that was more of as an individual, I would be glorifying it to call it a company, because it was really just me.
I mean, you really do come from a family of free spirits, don't you?
Yeah, I think that's true in a special way. And my grandparents were missionaries in China in the 30s and 40s, and at the time the war came along, they were living in Anhui province, and they had 2 sons off at boarding school, and my mother and her sister and their older brother were living at home. And then the Japanese front line crossed where the school was, and so the boys were stuck there basically, and that became a concentration camp, and it was a very intense, scary time, and some of their friends didn't make it, but they eventually did make it, and then back to Canada, where they set up in farming. And I guess, you know, it's like a family with a sense of mission, a family that didn't really value money overly, valued experience a great deal.
What's next for you in Starfish?
So, well, we're going to continue growing Starfish. We've got some very interesting new ways to address the market that we're pursuing this year. And then we're going to keep adding more companies to the mix. So that's it's going to be really interesting.
And then you're going to have to move cultures together, and there's going to be
Yeah,
whole new
so-
communities
well,
to build.
That's right. So community, culture, huge big issues as aspects of leadership. And that's very true. And I think that's the danger when you acquire a company. Don't acquire one that's too big, otherwise their culture will become your culture.
Yeah, yeah. You have to be careful around that.
And we're definitely believers in having consistent cultural framework across the enterprise.
Yeah. Scott, there's just far too much to talk about.
So that's true. That's too much fun.
Thank you so much for coming.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Pleasure.